Professor Eleanor Hartley stood confidently at the front of the lecture hall, the rhythmic scratch of chalk filling the air as she wrote a complex calculus equation on the board. Her posture was perfect, her movements deliberate, and the class could feel her authority without a word. She had been teaching for over 20 years and had earned the respect of her students through her unwavering discipline and high expectations. But today, her attention wasn't just on the equation, it was on the new student sitting near the back of the room, Marcus Caldwell. His presence stood out. Eleanor had heard whispers about him. He had transferred from a small college and, in her view, didn't belong in her advanced calculus class. This was a course for the best and brightest, students from elite backgrounds who had been handpicked to succeed in academia. Marcus didn't seem like one of them. Eleanor set her chalk down, her eyes scanning the room. She looked briefly at the front row where her top students sat, all poised to take notes and absorb the lecture. Then she shifted her gaze to Marcus, who sat with a calm and collected demeanor. His notebook was open, but he wasn't scribbling down every word she wrote on the board like the others. Instead, his pen tapped lightly against the page, as if he were simply observing. "All right," she said, addressing the class. "This problem should challenge even my best students." Her gaze lingered on the front row, ensuring they understood the weight of her words. "Let's see how Mr. Caldwell does." A few students turned toward Marcus, some curious, others skeptical. The challenge was clear. She was testing him. Marcus didn't seem fazed in the slightest. "Since we have a new addition to the class," Eleanor continued, her voice smooth, "perhaps Mr. Caldwell would like to introduce himself." Marcus paused for a moment, then spoke with quiet confidence. "I'm Marcus Caldwell. I transferred from Springfield College." There was no attempt to impress, no nervousness, just a simple statement. Eleanor nodded tightly, feeling her expectations of him deepen. "I hope you're prepared," she said, her voice cool. "This class isn't easy. Do you have the prerequisite coursework?" "I do," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. His confidence bothered her, and she wasn't about to let it slide. "Let's see where you stand then," she said, turning back to the board. She pointed to the complex equation. "Can you tell me the first step in solving this?" The class was silent, all eyes on Marcus. It was a common practice for professors to challenge a new student like this, to see how they handled pressure. Eleanor expected hesitation, uncertainty, something she could exploit. Marcus didn't flinch. He studied the equation for a moment, then responded confidently. "You'd start with partial fraction decomposition, but given the structure, a Laplace transform would be more efficient." The room fell silent. His answer wasn't just correct, it was insightful. Most students would have fumbled through a basic decomposition, but Marcus had bypassed the usual steps and jumped straight to a more advanced method. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the chalk, momentarily caught off guard. "Unconventional," she said with a forced smile, trying to mask her discomfort. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Caldwell. We'll see if your methods hold up." She turned back to the board, but in the back of her mind a seed of doubt had been planted. This wasn't going to be as simple as she'd hoped. The rest of the class seemed to be holding its breath. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Marcus's answer had been far too quick, too precise. She had expected him to stumble, perhaps ask for clarification, or at least show some signs of uncertainty. But he hadn't. His response had been sharp, calculated, and far beyond what she thought someone in his position could offer. Eleanor pushed the thought to the back of her mind and resumed her lecture. But as she continued, her focus shifted between the equation on the board and Marcus, who remained calm and collected in his seat. Unlike the other students, who were scribbling frantically, he simply watched, his pen tapping against the notebook in a steady rhythm. His lack of visible effort irritated her. It was as if he believed this class was beneath him, and that made her want to test him even more. She glanced over at her brightest students, those from prestigious prep schools whose families donated generously to the university. They were the ones who had earned their place in the class, and she had taken great pride in mentoring them over the years. Jamal, or Marcus as he was now called, hadn't earned that right. He shouldn't have been here. Taking a breath, Eleanor decided to push forward. "All right," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Let's see if Mr. Caldwell's understanding can hold up under pressure. Can you explain why a Laplace transform is more efficient here? The class was tense. Some students exchanged curious glances, unsure of what to expect. Others watched Marcus, waiting for him to falter, expecting the failure that Eleanor had so carefully anticipated. But Marcus, unfazed, met her eyes and replied, "It simplifies the process, especially in cases where the function is already a rational function of polynomials," he said, his tone even. "It avoids unnecessary steps and directly tackles the integral's complexity." Eleanor felt a flicker of frustration. He was right again. She could sense the class growing more and more uncomfortable as Marcus continued to answer without hesitation. There was no sign of struggle, no moment where he stumbled or second-guessed himself. It was as though he had already anticipated her next move, and his confidence made her feel small in front of the class. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't that Marcus was wrong, quite the opposite. He was demonstrating a level of understanding she didn't expect. He was seeing the math not just as a set of procedures, but as a series of decisions, each leading to a more elegant, efficient solution. It was impressive, and that irked her. "Unconventional," she muttered again, trying to regain control. "But I'm not convinced that it's the right approach for every situation. There's a time and place for everything." Marcus didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, absorbing the criticism as if it were just another comment. And yet in his calmness, Eleanor could feel the tension building within her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He wasn't supposed to make her feel as though she were the one on trial. She pressed on, still trying to reassert herself. "Let's move on," she said briskly, redirecting the class. "This is a good discussion, but we have other material to cover." As the lecture continued, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that the damage had already been done. The students were exchanging glances, some whispering, others eyeing her with a new sense of uncertainty. Marcus had not just answered the questions, he had done so effortlessly. The class had taken note. Eleanor knew she would have to do something to regain control, but she also knew deep down that she couldn't just dismiss him the way she had planned. She would need to be more careful now, to keep pushing him further, to find a crack in his armor. But for the first time in a long while, she felt unsure, and that was a feeling she hadn't expected. As the class continued, Eleanor's attempts to regain control over the room became more desperate. Every time she glanced at Marcus, he sat there, cool and unfazed, his pen tapping lightly against his notebook. The students were still watching, some with interest, others with barely hidden amusement. They were starting to pick up on the dynamic. Marcus wasn't struggling, wasn't breaking under pressure. In fact, he wasn't even trying to impress anyone. He just answered the questions, each response as calm as the last. Eleanor's frustration grew with every passing minute. She had hoped the first challenge would expose his weaknesses. She had expected him to buckle under her scrutiny, to show his inexperience, to reveal that he wasn't ready for this level of coursework. But he hadn't. Instead, he had been more than competent. He had been impressive. He wasn't like the students who came to her for help, desperate to make the grade. Marcus was someone who seemed to understand the material in a way that unsettled her. "All right, Mr. Caldwell," she said sharply, trying to hide the edge of frustration in her voice. "Let's move on to this next part. Can you walk us through this proof?" Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. His response was quick, precise. "You would start by factoring the equation, then apply the integration by parts formula to simplify the integral before taking the limit." His answer was clean, efficient, and once again, correct. Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek to keep her composure. There was no hesitation from Marcus, no signs of self-doubt. He answered as though this was second nature to him, as though he had been doing these types of problems for years. But she wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't let this student, this Marcus Caldwell, outshine her class in front of her. Her mind raced for another question, a more difficult challenge. "Interesting approach," she said, forcing a smile. "But do you really think that's the most efficient method? What if you tried another path? Say the method of undetermined coefficients?" Marcus didn't react to her challenge. His response was calm, and this time, there was a subtle shift in his tone. "It's a valid approach, but it would involve more steps. The method I suggested gets to the solution more directly. There it was again. No hesitation. It was as though he had considered every possible option and had chosen the one that made the most sense, the one that was the simplest yet most effective. That was what frustrated Eleanor the most. Marcus wasn't trying to show off. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just knew the material, and that was more than she was prepared to admit. The students were beginning to exchange glances again. A few were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that Marcus wasn't the underdog they had expected. Some of the more arrogant students, those who had initially found amusement in watching the new guy struggle, were starting to grow uncomfortable. The whispers that had begun earlier were now more frequent, quieter, but still very much present. Eleanor knew she had to regain control before this class spun entirely out of her grasp. She had spent years cultivating her image as a professor who knew everything, a professor who could expose any student's weaknesses. But now, with Marcus Caldwell standing so confidently in front of her, she felt like the one being tested. She turned back to the board, writing the next equation with a sharp, deliberate motion. "All right, let's move on," she said, though the words came out more clipped than she intended. "This next problem is more challenging. Let's see if you've been paying attention." But as she worked through the next problem, her mind kept drifting back to Marcus. Each answer he gave, each question he handled with grace, only made her more certain that he was different from the others. And that made her nervous. The students, too, could feel it. The class that had once been a space where Eleanor Hartley commanded respect was now a place of quiet tension. The whispers about Marcus were no longer filled with amusement or skepticism. They were filled with intrigue. Eleanor realized that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have control. And it was a feeling that left her unsettled, unprepared for what was to come. The next class started much like the last, but this time, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the usual hum of conversation that greeted the beginning of a lecture was noticeably absent. Eleanor Hartley stood at the front of the room, her marker poised in the air, but her eyes kept drifting to Marcus Caldwell. Word had spread quickly that Marcus had not only survived her first round of questioning, but had done so with a calm assurance that had left the class in awe. Eleanor tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. She needed to take control again. She couldn't allow a student, especially one who clearly didn't belong, become the focal point of her class. As the students filed in, they took their seats with a new sense of anticipation, their eyes frequently darting to the back of the room. Marcus had become a topic of curiosity, and now even the most self-assured students were starting to look at him differently. He wasn't just some transfer student who would fade into the background. He was a challenge, and that was something the class hadn't expected. Eleanor began writing a long, complex equation on the board, one that would require everything they had learned so far in the course. She watched as the students leaned forward, their pens poised and ready to work, but her eyes lingered on Marcus. This would be the test. She had to break him, had to catch him off guard. As she finished writing, she turned toward the class. Her voice was calm, authoritative. "This problem will require everything we've covered so far. It's advanced, time-consuming, and even professionals struggle with it. I expect full effort from everyone." The students exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to expect. They knew the problem would be difficult, but the mention of professionals raised the stakes. But then Eleanor's gaze fixed on Marcus. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth, almost too calculated. "Since you seem to enjoy participating, why don't you take a crack at it?" A hush fell over the room. Every student's eyes shifted to Marcus. This was no longer about solving an equation. It was about control, about watching him fail. They had seen him answer every question with confidence. But this was a different beast entirely. Now Eleanor had given him the floor. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a trap. Marcus didn't flinch. He slowly stood up, his expression as calm as it had been since the beginning. There was no sign of nervousness, no hesitation. He walked to the front of the room and took the marker from Eleanor's hand. The class, which had been buzzing with whispered speculation, fell silent. All eyes were on him. Eleanor stood by the side, arms crossed, watching him with a gaze that could cut glass. He studied the equation on the board for a few seconds, his face impassive. Then, without a hint of uncertainty, he began to write. At first, no one reacted. His movements were fluid, precise. He didn't pause, didn't hesitate. His hand moved across the board, each line of the solution building on the last. He wasn't second-guessing himself or dwelling on the complexity of the problem. He was solving it, quickly, efficiently. The students watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they were seeing. This wasn't the usual frantic scrambling to find the answer. Marcus was working through the problem with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. As the minutes passed, more and more students began to exchange looks. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to each other, trying to process what was happening. And then, with a final stroke, Marcus stepped back. The equation was solved. Clean, efficient, beautiful. A heavy silence filled the room. Eleanor's expression had shifted. The usual sharpness in her eyes had been replaced with something else, something unreadable. She stepped forward, her gaze scanning the board as she read through Marcus's solution, searching for an error. She found none. For a long moment she stood there, her fingers gripping the edge of the board. There was nothing to criticize, no mistakes, no shortcuts. It was flawless. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his posture calm, his face unreadable, waiting. The rest of the class was still, stunned by what had just happened. Eleanor, for the first time in years, was caught off guard. She had expected him to stumble, to fail, but instead he had defied her every expectation. "Unconventional," Eleanor finally said, her voice forced and strained. "But I suppose it works." But then, just as Eleanor tried to regain control, a voice cut through the air. "I wouldn't call it unconventional." Everyone turned toward the back of the room, where a man in a sharp suit stood. He was in his mid-50s, with an air of authority that commanded attention. The students murmured in surprise. That voice belonged to Dr. Thomas Adler, a professor from MIT, known for his groundbreaking work in applied calculus and advanced mathematical models. He stepped forward, a small smile on his face. "I'd call it exceptional." The entire classroom shifted. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide as Dr. Adler, one of the most respected professors in the field, examined Marcus's work. The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Adler was not just anyone. His presence commanded respect. Eleanor knew it. The balance of power in the room had just shifted. The room was silent, the weight of Dr. Adler's approval hanging in the air. Eleanor stood frozen, a tight knot forming in her stomach. She had seen many students over the years, many brilliant minds who had come and gone through her classroom, but none like Marcus Caldwell. She had been so sure he was an anomaly, a mistake. But now, with Dr. Adler's words echoing in the room, Eleanor realized she had misjudged him, and herself. Dr. Adler studied Marcus's solution for a moment longer, before nodding with approval. "I haven't seen a student tackle a problem like that in years. Most would take 3 or 4 more steps, but you bypassed unnecessary transformations. It's clean, efficient." Marcus simply nodded, his face still neutral, not even a hint of pride showing through. His calmness only added to Eleanor's growing discomfort. She had prided herself on her ability to spot talent, on her reputation as a sharp, discerning professor. But Marcus had exposed the flaws in her judgment, and now Dr. Adler, a respected peer, was the one pointing it out. The class was in an uproar of whispers. A few students exchanged astonished glances. Some were already pulling out their phones, likely to discuss the event with their peers or post about it. Eleanor felt the eyes of the class on her, and for the first time, she could sense the shift in power. She was no longer the one in control. Trying to maintain some semblance of authority, Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice tight. "Well, Mr. Caldwell," she said, trying to mask the edge in her tone, "that was certainly unconventional." She wanted to regain control, but the words felt hollow, weak. She turned to erase the board, but the weight of Dr. Adler's praise still lingered in the air. It felt like the room was no longer hers. Before she could erase everything, Dr. Adler spoke again, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "Have you ever considered applying to MIT?" The words hit the class like a thunderclap. Marcus blinked, clearly surprised by the question. but there was no hesitation in his response. "I've never really thought about it," he said, his voice even. Dr. Adler smiled slightly, clearly impressed. "I think you should. You have a way of thinking that's rare. We could use minds like yours." The class had gone silent again, but this time, the whispers were different. They weren't about Marcus's initial struggle, or about him being an outsider in a class full of privileged students. No, now they were filled with awe, envy, and curiosity. Jamal Caldwell had just been offered an opportunity few could ever dream of, a direct invitation to one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Eleanor stood by, her face a mask of forced composure. Her grip on her marker tightened, but it didn't help her steady her nerves. She had just witnessed her authority unravel in front of her very eyes. And now Dr. Adler was making sure everyone knew exactly how wrong she had been. "Think about it," Dr. Adler said, handing Marcus a business card. "And if you're interested, give me a call." Marcus took the card, still calm, and gave a small nod. "I will. Thank you, Dr. Adler." As Dr. Adler turned to leave, he glanced back at Eleanor, his smile almost amused. "Margaret," he said, his tone light but pointed, "looks like you might have misjudged this one." The students were still processing everything, but Eleanor could already sense how the balance of power in the room had changed. They would never look at her the same way again, and neither would she. The class ended with Eleanor dismissing them quickly, her words curt, her usual confident demeanor completely gone. She had lost control of the room, and there was no getting it back. The students filed out in a slow trickle, some lingering to speak with Marcus, others whispering amongst themselves. Eleanor remained at the front of the room long after the students had gone, her fingers gripping the marker so tightly it was almost painful. She had spent years cultivating an image of authority, of being the one everyone turned to for answers. But today, that image had been shattered, not just in front of Marcus, but in front of everyone in the room. She had been exposed, her biases clear for all to see. Outside, Marcus walked down the hallway, the card from Dr. Adler still in his pocket. He felt no need to gloat or make any show of victory. He had known this moment was coming. He had spent years preparing for it, for moments when others underestimated him. But today, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time, by someone who recognized his potential. As he left the building, he thought about the future, about the opportunities now open to him. He had already proved himself once again. Now it was up to him to decide what came next. Back in the classroom, Eleanor sat at her desk, staring at the space where Marcus had stood. For the first time in years, she wasn't the smartest person in the room, and it was a feeling she hated more than anything.